The wrench in Daniel Forsythe's hand stopped mid-turn the moment the heel of a $4,000 pair of shoes clicked against the concrete floor of his garage. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. The whole shop had gone quiet, the way it always did when Vanessa Cole walked anywhere, like the air itself decided to stand at attention. She came through the bay doors in a cream-colored coat that probably cost more than his truck, sunglasses pushed up into hair so perfectly blown out it looked unreal under the fluorescent lights, and behind her, gliding silently, was the silver Mercedes AMG she'd dropped off 2 days earlier with a grinding noise in the transmission that turned out to be a cracked flex plate. "It's ready," Daniel said, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better decades. "Runs clean now. You'll want to keep an eye on the coolant for the next week, just in case, but it shouldn't give you any more trouble." "Good." She didn't look at him. She was looking at her phone. He slid the invoice across the metal counter between them. $218. Parts, labor, the diagnostic he'd done for free because the noise had worried her enough that she'd called the shop twice in one night, panicked, asking if it was safe to drive. He'd told her it wasn't, and he'd told her to leave it overnight, and he'd stayed an extra hour after closing to make sure it'd be ready when she needed it the next morning. For some meeting, she said couldn't be moved. She glanced at the number. Her mouth pulled into something that wasn't quite a smile. $218 for what was probably a 20-minute job. It was a 4-hour job, Daniel said evenly. The flex plate's underneath the transmission housing. Had to drop the whole assembly to get to it. I don't have time to debate mechanic math with you. She was already turning toward the car, keys glinting in her hand. "Bill my assistant. She'll sort it out. Cole." He kept his voice level the way he always did, the way 15 years of fixing rich people's cars and being talked down to by rich people had trained into him. "I already tried that route last month, with the brake job. Your assistant said to bill you directly. I need payment today. I've got parts to restock and a payroll to make Friday." That got her attention, finally. She turned and for the first time looked at him. Really looked the kind of look that measured a man by his coveralls and his calloused hands and decided in under 2 seconds exactly how much he was worth talking to. "You're seriously doing this in front of everyone?" Daniel glanced around. There were 4 guys in the bay. Marcus on the lift, 2 apprentices by the tire machine, and old Pete at the register, all of them suddenly very interested in things that weren't this conversation. He hadn't meant to do anything in front of everyone. He'd meant to hand her a bill and get paid for honest work. "I'm not doing anything," he said. "I'm asking you to settle your invoice, and I'm telling you I'm not paying $200 for half an hour of labor." Her voice had risen now, sharp enough that even Pete looked up from the register. "If you wanted to charge me fairly, you should have called before doing the work. This is exactly the kind of bait and switch that gives places like this a bad name." It wasn't fair, and it wasn't true, and Daniel felt the heat climb up the back of his neck the way it did whenever someone tried to rewrite reality in front of an audience. He thought about saying something sharp back. He thought about a lot of things in that half-second. But he thought, too, about his daughter, about Hazel, 8 years old, waiting for him at his sister's house because the school had called about a stomachache, and about the look she'd give him tonight if he came home angry instead of just tired, and he let the moment pass through him instead of out of him. "You don't have to agree with the price," he said. "But the work's done, and it's fair. I'd appreciate it if you paid. I'd appreciate it if you understood that I have people who handle things like this," Vanessa said, sliding her sunglasses down over her eyes like a door closing. "I'm not paying you. Send the invoice somewhere else." She got into the car. The engine, his engine, the one he'd rebuilt the flex plate of with his own 2 hands at 11 o'clock at night, turned over smooth and quiet, and she pulled out of the bay without another word, leaving Daniel standing there holding a piece of paper that represented 4 hours of his life and the cost of dinner that week. Marcus climbed down off the lift once she was gone. "You good?" "I'm fine." Daniel folded the invoice and put it in his back pocket, like it was something he could still cash in later, somewhere, somehow. Just another Tuesday. But it wasn't just another Tuesday, not really, because $218 wasn't nothing to a man who'd been raising a daughter alone for 3 years, who did the math on grocery bills in his head before he got to the register, who'd learned to love peanut butter sandwiches because they stretched a paycheck further than anything else did. It wasn't about the principle so much as it was about the truth, that some people could walk through the world taking whatever they wanted from whoever was beneath them, and the rest of the world just had to swallow it and say thank you for the privilege of being used. Hazel was waiting on the porch steps of Daniel's sister's house when he pulled up that evening, knees pulled to her chest, a coloring book open beside her that she clearly hadn't touched in an hour. She had her mother's eyes, pale gray, unreadable in certain light, and his stubborn chin, and when she saw the truck, stood up so fast she nearly tripped over the book. "Dad, hey, Bug!" He caught her halfway down the steps, swung her up even though she was getting too big for it now, all elbows and knees and the particular gangliness of 8 going on 9. "Tummy still hurting?" It was fake, she admitted into his shoulder, the way she always confessed things. Quietly, like she was handing over something fragile. "I just didn't want to do the spelling test." He should have been annoyed. He was too tired to be annoyed. "We'll talk about honesty tomorrow. Tonight we're getting grilled cheese and you're going to bed early." In the truck, she chattered about nothing. A girl at school who'd brought a hamster for show and tell. A boy who'd thrown up at lunch. The unfairness of recess being only 20 minutes. And Daniel let her voice wash over him like something he could warm his hands on. This was the part of the day that made the rest of it bearable. Not the invoices that didn't get paid. Not the customers who looked through him like he was part of the equipment. This, a kid in a booster seat she was almost too old for, narrating her small, complete universe like it was the only thing that mattered. Because to him it was. He didn't tell her about Vanessa Cole. He never told her about days like that one. There was a version of fatherhood he'd promised himself the night Renee left. Quietly, without a scene, just a note on the kitchen counter and a closet half emptied while he was at work. And that version didn't include burdening an 8-year-old with the weight of her father's bad days. She didn't need to know that grown adults could be cruel for sport. She'd learn that eventually. He wasn't going to be the one to teach her early. That night, after grilled cheese and a bath and 3 chapters of a book about a girl who could talk to dogs, he sat at the kitchen table with the shop's books spread out in front of him. The unpaid invoice from Vanessa Cole sitting on top like an accusation. $218 wasn't going to sink him. But it was the 4th unpaid invoice in 2 months, all from clients who treated the shop like a charity that happened to also fix cars. And the math was starting to bend in a direction he didn't like. He thought about his father, who'd run this same shop for 30 years before a heart attack took him at 61, who used to say that the measure of a man wasn't what he did when people were watching, but what he did when they weren't, and when no one was else watching, who he chose to be anyway. Daniel had buried his father 6 years ago and inherited a building, 4 lifts, a loyal but small client base, and a reputation that took decades to build and could be undone in a single bad review. He closed the books, turned off the kitchen light, and went to check on his daughter, who was asleep with one arm flung over her face, like she was shielding herself from a son that wasn't there. He didn't know it yet, but the woman in the cream-colored coat had a father of her own. And in 11 days, that man would walk into Daniel's shop and change the entire shape of both their lives. The week that followed was unremarkable in the way most weeks were: brake jobs and oil changes and one memorable incident involving a raccoon that had taken up residence in someone's engine bay. Daniel called Vanessa Cole's office twice about the invoice. The first time, her assistant, a young man named Trevor who sounded perpetually apologetic, said he'd look into it. The second time, Trevor didn't pick up at all. On Thursday, Marcus brought it up while they were both elbow-deep in a stubborn alternator. "You ever gonna just eat that 218 and move on?" "Already did, basically," Daniel said. "Not gonna chase a woman who drives a car worth more than this whole shop for $200. Just annoys me she did it in front of everybody. Like I'm supposed to be grateful she even let me fix it. That's rich people for you. Money's not even real to them anymore. It's just a number that means nothing." Marcus tightened a bolt with more force than strictly necessary. "My cousin used to valet at one of those big hotels downtown. Said half the people who handed him their keys couldn't tell you what $100 felt like in their hand. Didn't even count it. Just peeled it off like skin." Daniel laughed despite himself, the tension of the week loosening slightly. That was the thing about the shop, about Marcus and Pete and the 2 apprentices who couldn't keep their hands clean to save their lives. They made the bad days survivable. There was a kind of brotherhood in grease-stained coveralls that he'd never found anywhere else, not even in the marriage that had ended 3 years ago in a quiet, devastating note on a kitchen counter. He thought about Renee less now than he used to. In the beginning, the absence of her had been a physical thing, a hole he kept reaching toward out of habit, like a missing tooth his tongue couldn't stop finding. Now it was just a fact of his life, like the shop, like the truck, like Hazel's gap-toothed smile that was slowly filling in with adult teeth. She'd left because she said she couldn't do this anymore. This being marriage to a man who came home smelling like motor oil and worked Saturdays and didn't have the kind of ambition that led anywhere glamorous. She'd left a 4-year-old behind with barely a backward glance, and Daniel had spent the years since trying to be enough father for 2 parents, because that was the job now, whether he'd signed up for the whole of it or not. He didn't resent Hazel for any of it. He resented, sometimes, late at night, the idea that there were people in the world, people like Vanessa Cole, who got to skate through life on inherited comfort, while men like him worked themselves down to the bone and still got treated like an inconvenience. He didn't know that the universe, in its strange and unhurried way, was already setting something in motion to balance the scale. The man arrived on a Friday morning just after 8, while the shop was still smelling of fresh coffee and the previous night's rain. He came in an unremarkable black sedan. Not flashy, not new, the kind of car a person drove when they didn't need to prove anything to anyone, and he parked it carefully between the lines like a man who respected order. He was somewhere in his late 60s, silver-haired, dressed in a charcoal overcoat that fit him the way good clothes fit people who'd worn good clothes their whole lives, without trying. He walked with a cane he didn't seem to need, more habit than necessity, tapping it once against the concrete as he stepped through the bay doors. Daniel was under a Honda Civic when the man's shoes, polished expensive but not ostentatious, stopped a few feet from the edge of the lift. "Excuse me," the man said. His voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that came from a lifetime of never needing to raise it. "I'm looking for the owner." "That's me?" Daniel rolled out from underneath the car, wiped his hands, and stood. Up close, the man had pale blue eyes and a face that had clearly known both significant kindness and significant grief, the lines around his mouth suggesting both in equal measure. "Daniel Forsyth. What can I do for you?" "Walter Cole." The man extended a hand, and Daniel shook it, noting the firm grip, the slight tremor that suggested age rather than weakness. "I believe you did some work recently on a car belonging to my daughter." Daniel felt his stomach drop half an inch. "Vanessa Cole, that's right." Walter's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened, like a man settling in to listen rather than to talk. "I'd like you to tell me about it, all of it, and I'd appreciate the truth, even the parts that might not flatter her." Daniel hesitated. There was a version of this conversation where he played it safe, said something vague and diplomatic, protected a client relationship that was already broken anyway. But there was something in Walter Cole's face, a kind of tired honesty, a man who'd clearly heard 100 polished lies in his life and had no patience left for one more, that made Daniel decide to just tell him. So he did. The flex plate, the 4 hours, the invoice for $218, the refusal to pay, the comment about bait-and-switch tactics made loud enough for the whole shop to hear. He didn't editorialize. He didn't need to. The facts, laid out plainly, did all the work themselves. Walter listened without interrupting, his hands folded over the head of his cane, his eyes fixed somewhere over Daniel's shoulder, as if he were watching the scene replay itself on the wall behind him. When Daniel finished, there was a long silence, filled only by the clatter of an air wrench from the next bay over. "May I see the invoice?" Walter asked finally. Daniel pulled it from the folder behind the counter. He'd kept it, unable to quite throw it away like evidence of something he might need to prove later, and handed it over. Walter studied it for a long moment, then reached into his coat and produced a checkbook, old-fashioned, leather-bound, the kind men of his generation still carried out of habit, even in a world that had largely moved past them. "I'll pay this," he said, already writing. "You don't have to do that, Mr. Cole. That's between me and your daughter. I know I don't have to." Walter tore the check free and set it on the counter, face down, the way a man sets down a card he doesn't want read yet. "I'm doing it because it's right, and because I'm tired of watching my daughter believe that being right means never having to be kind." He looked up, and for the first time something almost apologetic crossed his face. "I built a company from nothing, Mr. Forsyth. 41 years ago, I was sleeping in the back of a delivery van because I couldn't afford an apartment and a business loan at the same time. I know what it is to be a man whose labor is treated like it doesn't count. I never wanted my daughter to forget where money like ours comes from. I'm afraid I failed at that somewhere along the way." Daniel didn't know what to say. He glanced down at the check, still face down on the counter, and didn't reach for it. "Go ahead," Walter said. "Turn it over." Daniel turned it over. It wasn't $218. It was $218.00, written in careful, deliberate cursive. The exact amount of the invoice, not a penny more. And for one disorienting second, Daniel felt almost disappointed, like he'd expected, somewhere in the back of his mind, something more dramatic. But Walter was still watching him, and there was something in his expression that suggested the check wasn't the point. The check was just the opening move. "That settles the invoice," Walter said. "But I didn't drive out here just to pay a $200 bill, Mr. Forsyth. A man in my position has people for that." He tapped his cane once against the floor, a small, decisive sound. "I drove out here because I wanted to look the man in the eye who my daughter humiliated in front of his own employees and decide for myself what kind of man he was. Whether he was the kind who'd have made a scene back." Whether he was the kind who'd have let it slide because making a fuss wasn't worth the trouble. I needed to know which one you were before I decided what to do next. And, Daniel asked, against his better judgment. And I asked your men while you were under that car, Walter said, with the faint trace of a smile. All 4 of them. Every single one told me the same thing, more or less. That you stayed late to fix the car right. That you tried to collect the bill quietly through proper channels before ever saying a word in front of anyone. That you didn't raise your voice once, even when she did. One of your apprentices told me you let him take credit for fixing a fuel pump on a school teacher's car last spring, because the teacher couldn't afford it, and you wanted him to feel proud of doing it for free, instead of feeling like charity. Walter's pale eyes held his, steady. That's not the profile of a man looking for an angle, Mr. Forsyth. That's the profile of a man who does the right thing because he doesn't know how to do anything else. There aren't many of those left. I've spent 4 decades in business, and I can count the genuine ones on 2 hands. Daniel felt heat rise in his face, unused to being studied this closely, this approvingly. I just fix cars, Mr. Cole. I'm not trying to be a saint about it. That's precisely the point. Walter's voice had gathered something like quiet conviction now. The saints I've met in business were always performing for an audience. You weren't performing for anyone. You didn't even know I was coming. He paused, glancing around the shop, the worn but organized tool walls, the handwritten safety reminders taped above each bay, the photo Daniel kept pinned by the register of Hazel at her last birthday, grinning with frosting on her nose. I read people for a living, Mr. Forsyth. Or I did before I stepped back from running things day to day. I built Cole Industrial Holdings reading rooms full of men who wanted my money and were willing to say anything to get it. You are not one of those men, and that, believe it or not, makes you exceedingly rare and exceedingly valuable. I appreciate that, Daniel said carefully, still unsure where this was going, still half expecting some catch to surface. But I run a 6-bay shop in a town most people drive through to get somewhere else. I'm not sure what use that is to a man like you. You'd be surprised. Walter reached into his coat again and withdrew a second item. Not a check this time, but a thick cream-colored envelope sealed heavier than paper alone should be. I own 40% of a mid-sized auto parts distribution chain across 6 states. The man who's run operations for the past 19 years is retiring at the end of the quarter, and the board is deadlocked on a successor. Because every candidate they've found cares more about margins than about the mechanics who actually keep the supply chain honest. I need someone who understands in his hands and not just his spreadsheets what it actually costs, in time, in sweat, in dignity, to fix something properly. He set the envelope on the counter beside the check. I'd like you to consider running it. Daniel stared at the envelope like it might be a trick of the light. Mr. Cole, I appreciate the gesture, but I don't have any experience running a company that size. I've got a 6-man shop and a 3rd-grade education in business, mostly learned from my father and a lot of late nights with the books. Then you'll learn the rest. The way every good operator I've ever hired has learned it, by being honest about what you don't know and surrounding yourself with people who do. Walter's tone was patient but unmoving. A man accustomed to being taken seriously the first time he said something. I'm not interested in another MBA who can recite supply chain theory and has never changed his own oil. I'm interested in a man whose employees vouch for him unprompted to a stranger with a cane. The position pays $420,000 a year, with equity that vests over 4 years and, frankly, will be worth a great deal more than the salary by the time it does. There's a signing arrangement as well. I'd like to make a gesture that reflects how seriously I take this and how seriously I take the apology my daughter owes you and has not yet given. He slid a second check across the counter alongside the first. This one had several more zeros on it than the first. Daniel read the number twice, certain he'd misplaced a decimal point somewhere in the reading. He hadn't. $19,218. The exact original invoice amount, folded into a number so large it barely registered as currency anymore, more like a sentence he was being asked to parse in a language he half understood. This is a mistake, Daniel said quietly. It's not. Walter's voice was firm now, almost stern. It's a signing bonus and an apology combined, because my daughter's apology should have come with consequence and I intend to make sure it does. You'll find the position itself is real, the company is real, and the job will be hard. Harder, in some ways, than turning wrenches, because the politics of a boardroom are uglier than anything you'll find under a hood. But I think you're the kind of man who can survive ugly politics without becoming uglier himself. That's worth more to me than an MBA. I learned that the hard way, building everything I have from a van I slept in. He paused and something in his face softened, the businessman receding for a moment behind something more fatherly, more weary. I have one daughter, Mr. Forsyth. I love her more than anything in this world, and I have watched her become someone I do not always recognize. Someone who looks at a man like you and sees an inconvenience instead of a person. I don't know if I can fix that in her, but I can make sure that the next time she tries to walk over someone, the person under her feet is standing on solid ground instead of sinking. Yet Daniel looked down at the two checks, the small one and the impossible one, side by side on the counter like two versions of the same story. He thought about Hazel, asleep that morning with her arm over her face. He thought about the spreadsheet of unpaid invoices in his kitchen, about the grilled cheese dinners, about every silent calculation he'd made standing in a grocery store aisle deciding what they could and couldn't afford that week. I need to think about it, he said finally, because it felt important to say it. Important not to grab at it like a drowning man grabs at driftwood, even though every fiber of him wanted to. This is a lot, Mr. Cole. I've got a daughter. I've got guys here who depend on this shop for their paychecks. I can't just walk away from that because a check showed up. Something shifted in Walter's expression. Approval, unmistakable, the kind that couldn't be performed. Good, he said. That's exactly the answer I was hoping you'd give. A man who says yes to $19 million without a single moment's hesitation is a man I wouldn't trust to run a lemonade stand. Take your time. Talk to your men. Talk to your daughter if she's old enough to understand it. The offer doesn't expire because you needed a week to be responsible about it. He picked up his cane, preparing to leave, then paused at the door. For what it's worth, the shop doesn't have to close if you take the job. I can arrange financing so you keep ownership and hire a manager to run daily operations. Cole Industrial could even become one of your suppliers, if the numbers make sense. There's no version of this where the place your father built has to disappear. I made sure of that before I ever wrote either check. He left as quietly as he'd arrived, the bell over the door chiming once behind him, the black sedan pulling away with the same careful precision it had arrived with. Daniel stood at the counter for a long time after he left, the two checks still sitting there, Marcus and Pete and the apprentices all drifting closer in the particular silence of men who'd clearly overheard far more than they were supposed to. Did that just happen? Pete said finally. Or did I get into the cooking sherry again? Daniel didn't tell Hazel that night. He needed time to hold the news himself first, to turn it over in his hands like a tool he didn't yet know how to use. He called his sister instead, sat on her back porch with two beers neither of them drank, and told her the whole thing from the beginning. Vanessa Cole's refusal to pay, the silver-haired man with the cane, the two checks that didn't make any sense sitting next to each other. You're going to take it, his sister said. It wasn't a question. I don't know, Daniel. She gave him the look she'd been giving him since they were kids, the one that meant she could see straight through whatever he was telling himself. You've worked yourself into the ground for that shop since Dad died. You haven't taken a vacation in 6 years. You eat ramen on Thursdays so Hazel can have the good cereal on Fridays. This is the universe handing you a parachute. You take the parachute, it's not that simple. What if I'm terrible at it? What if I take this job and in a year they realize I'm just a mechanic who got lucky and I've burned the shop down to chase something I was never built for? What if you don't take it? His sister said quietly. And in 5 years you're still doing the exact same math at the exact same kitchen table. Except Hazel's older and noticing more, and you've spent her whole childhood telling yourself you didn't deserve something better. That landed somewhere he didn't have a ready answer for. He thought about it for 4 days. He talked to Marcus, who told him without hesitation that he'd run the shop day to day in a heartbeat, and that Daniel's staying out of stubborn pride would be, in Marcus's exact words, the dumbest thing you've ever done, and you once tried to fix a transmission with duct tape. He talked to Pete, who cried a little, which surprised everyone, including Pete. He even eventually talked to Hazel, not about the money which felt too large and strange a concept to hand an 8-year-old, but about the idea of a new job, a different kind of work, maybe even a different town someday. Would I still see Uncle Marcus? She asked, which was the only question that seemed to matter to her, and when he promised her yes, she nodded like that settled it and went back to her coloring book. On the 5th day, he called Walter Cole's office and said yes. He didn't see Vanessa Cole again until 3 weeks later, in a glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of a building that still smelled faintly of new carpet and ambition, on his first official day as Chief Operating Officer of Cole Distribution Partners. He was wearing a suit that didn't quite fit right yet, that he'd bought in a hurry with his sister's help, and he felt every bit the imposter he'd worried he might become. Vanessa was already in the room when he walked in, sitting at the far end of the table with a folder she wasn't reading, her face carefully composed into something professionally neutral. She didn't look surprised to see him. Her father, evidently, had told her everything. Mr. Forsyth, she said, and her voice had none of the sharp edges it had had in the garage. It was smaller almost. Careful, Miss Cole. There was a long, uncomfortable pause, the kind that asked to be filled and then sat empty anyway because neither of them knew quite how to fill it. Finally, she set the folder down. My father told me what he did, the job offer, the check. Her jaw tightened slightly. He also told me what I did to you in your shop. Daniel didn't say anything. He'd learned over 15 years of customer service that silence often did more work than words, especially with people who needed room to arrive somewhere on their own. I was wrong, Vanessa said, the words coming out stiff, unpracticed, like a language she didn't speak often, not just about the invoice. About all of it. The way I spoke to you in front of your employees. I've spent my whole life being told I'm brilliant, that I'm a visionary, that the company runs better because I push people. I don't think anyone's ever told me that I was just being cruel and calling it efficiency. She looked down at her hands. My father said you stayed an extra hour to fix my car properly instead of rushing it. He said you tried to collect the bill quietly 3 separate times before you ever said a word out loud. I didn't ask any of that. I didn't care to. I just decided you were beneath the conversation. You don't have to do this, Daniel said quietly. Your father already settled it. He settled the invoice. Vanessa met his eyes for the first time since he'd walked in. He didn't settle the part where I have to look at myself and figure out who I actually am underneath all the money. That part's still mine to do. She paused. I'd like to apologize properly. Not because my father's watching, and not because you're suddenly my colleague and it'd be awkward not to. Because it was wrong, and I knew it was wrong even while I was doing it, and I did it anyway because it was easier than being decent. Daniel considered her for a long moment. The careful posture, the hands folded too tightly together, the particular exhaustion of someone confronting a version of themselves they hadn't planned on meeting. He thought about the 8 years of being underestimated by people exactly like her, and the strange, undeserved grace of having one of them turn out, eventually, to be capable of seeing him. Apology accepted, he said. We start clean from here. I'm not interested in spending the next however many years reminding you what you did in a garage 3 weeks ago. I'm interested in whether we can build something decent together going forward. That's the only part that matters to me now. Something in her shoulders loosened, just slightly, like a held breath finally released. My father likes you, she said, an attempt at lightness that didn't quite land but wasn't unwelcome either. He doesn't like many people. He says you remind him of who he used to be before the company got big enough to make him forget what his hands used to do for a living. Your father's a good man, Daniel said. He didn't have to do any of what he did. No, Vanessa agreed. He didn't. She glanced toward the window, toward the city sprawled out 14 floors below, full of people she'd probably never bothered to really see. I'm going to try to be more like that. I can't promise I'll be good at it right away, but I'm going to try. 6 months later, Daniel stood in the parking lot of a building he still sometimes couldn't believe had his name on the directory inside, watching Hazel run circles around a tree in the small courtyard the company had built for employees' kids, her laughter sharp and clear in the autumn air. Marcus ran the shop now, full-time, with a small ownership stake Daniel had insisted on as part of the transition. A way of making sure his father's name stayed on the building, even if Daniel's daily hands weren't the ones turning the wrenches anymore. Pete still worked the register 3 days a week because, as he put it, retirement made him feel old and the shop made him feel useful. The company was harder than Daniel had expected, in exactly the ways Walter had promised. The politics uglier, the spreadsheets denser, the learning curve steep enough that some nights he still came home and pulled out the same kind of late-night math he used to do over unpaid invoices. Except now the numbers had 6 zeros instead of 2, but he was good at it. Not because he'd become someone else to do the job, but because he'd brought the same things that had made him good at fixing cars. Honesty, patience, the simple, stubborn belief that doing the right thing was worth more than doing the easy thing, into a building that desperately needed more of both. Vanessa stopped by the courtyard that afternoon in jeans instead of a suit, which still looked strange on her, like a costume she was slowly growing into. She'd taken a smaller role in the company over the past few months, stepping back from the parts of the business that had made her cruel to make room for parts that might make her better. She watched Hazel chase a falling leaf across the grass and smiled, an expression that looked less performed than it used to. She's good, Vanessa said. Happy she is, Daniel agreed. Took her a minute to adjust, new school, new town. But kids bounce back faster than we do. I used to think money was the thing that mattered most, Vanessa said after a pause, watching Hazel collapse dramatically onto the grass in a fit of giggles only an 8-year-old could fully commit to. My father tried to tell me otherwise for years. I never listened, because I was too busy proving I deserved everything I already had. She glanced at Daniel, something almost wistful in her face. It took a $200 invoice and a mechanic who wouldn't back down to actually teach me the lesson my father spent a decade trying to. For what it's worth, Daniel said. I wasn't trying to teach anybody anything. I was just trying to get paid for a day's work. I know. Vanessa smiled, small but real. That's exactly why it worked. Hazel came running over a moment later, breathless, grass stains on her knees, and tugged at Daniel's sleeve with the particular urgency of an 8-year-old who'd just had an important thought. "Dad, can we get a dog?" "We'll talk about it," Daniel said, the same answer he'd given 100 times before, and Hazel groaned the way she always did, like she'd expected nothing less and was disappointed all the same. He watched her run back toward the tree, watched the late afternoon light catch in her hair the way it used to catch in her mother's. Except there was no ache in the comparison anymore, just a quiet, settled kind of peace. He thought about his father, who'd taught him that the measure of a man was what he did when no one was watching. And he thought that maybe in some strange and roundabout way, his father had been watching after all. Had set something in motion the day he handed down a six-bay shop and a stubborn, decent name, and had let the world take its time catching up to the truth of who his son really was. The truth, it turned out, didn't need an audience to be real. It just needed time and patience and the rare kind of person willing to notice it when it finally arrived.